Our guest speaker tonight is Mr. Rick Durham. This class kind of got started. He sent out an email and said, "Do you want to talk about gardening?" And after the ice and snow that it was last week, Rick, I am tickled to death to be talking about gardening tonight. So, my friend, I am going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, it's great to be here tonight. I think I probably started gardening about the same time as I learned to walk and talk. So it's been a little over 50 years. So I don't think there's much unexpected for me in gardening, but there certainly are pleasures every day. So this series, The Unexpected Pleasures of Gardening, I think will hopefully ring home with us. So let me pull up my slides. Sometimes this takes a minute on my computer. So if I freeze for a few minutes, I will be back. So it's just the nature of my computer. Okay, so you should be able to see that. That didn't take long. It helps when I do this when people are waiting. So we're ready to go. So tonight we're going to talk about home vegetable gardening. And I take this approach several ways. Sometimes I talk about home vegetable gardening, kind of conventionally in ground beds. Sometimes we talk about it with regard to raised beds, sometimes with containers, sometimes all three. And so tonight we're going to pretty much stick to conventional vegetable gardening. Now, there is going to be a talk later in the season on vegetable gardening in raised beds and containers, small space gardening. So you may get a notice for that presentation as well. But just to start off here, I always like to ask people, and I'll do this rhetorically. You don't have to answer, but why garden? So why do we garden? And I think there's some good reasons to garden. I think sometimes we may be a little bit naive when we get gardening, but so some reasons people usually tell me to garden is, for fresh produce. And I think, there's no mistaking that. When you can go out to your backyard or to your farm and pick something today and have it on the table tonight, you can't beat that freshness. And so, no doubt, gardening for fresh produce is a good reason. Another reason people will say is for variety, so if you're like me, this time of year is typical when the seed catalogs come in, although now I find that more often I get a link to them in my email, which is fine. But you look through those seed catalogs and you see all the different varieties that you can grow. You go down to southern states or Lowe's or Home Depot or your local, neighborhood nursery garden center, and they don't have that much variety. So and you go to the supermarket and there's usually less variety, right? So home gardening is a way for you to try, multiple varieties and things. Now, some people say they like to home garden because they're a little bit afraid of what might be on the food that they buy from the grocery store. Now, I'm a firm believer that our food supply is overall very safe. I think we have some of the safest food, anywhere in the world. But certainly, if you're growing it, then you know what you're spraying on it or what have you. And so, that maybe give you a confidence in knowing, what you're putting in your mouth and things like that. Now, inevitably, some people tell me that they garden to save money, right? So as best I can, I try to gingerly steer them to maybe think otherwise, because when you take into account the money that you spend on seeds, on supplies, on tools, maybe on materials that you use for preparing your soil. And then you think about, the amount of time that you put in gardening, and you put a dollar amount on that time, then it may be just as cheap for you to go to the grocery store or the farmer's market and buy your produce. But certainly, there are added benefits to that time gardening. We know that interaction with plants helps our mental health. It certainly helps us, our mobility when we're, gardening is good exercise. So those are intangible things, but just to say you're gardening to save money, don't think is not always true. So, there may be other reasons you garden. That's fine, but those are just a few of the things that I can think of that people typically tell me when they garden. So Phil in his introduction indicated that ID 128 is being updated, right? So it hasn't gone through all the bells and whistles yet, but it's close. So he provided you a link in the email to ID 128. I believe when this publication is updated, you can use that same link. It will update to the same link. So it will automatically give you the new version. Now, this new version is going to look like the one on the right. We have a pepper on the cover. The name of this pepper is Potapino. It's a jalapeno pepper that's specifically bred to be more compact, and so it's really suitable for people in container gardening. It doesn't mean it won't do well in conventional gardening. It will, but it's just a compact plant. So anyway, this the 2001 revised version of the Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky should be out soon. So in this publication, or I'm sorry, in this PowerPoint, I've made reference to some tables in ID 128. So a few of the early tables may have flip-flopped in terms of their numbers. So the numbers I'm giving you are for the new version of the publication. So if you run into any difficulty on that, the table should be close by, but the tables in the PowerPoint will reflect the new numbers of tables in the new version. Okay, so let's get started then in this PowerPoint. So I wanted to start off with a few slides about planning, and the first planning thing that we need to think about is, where do we garden? So for some of us, we may have limited space, and so we just garden where we can, right? But if we have, a larger space and we can make some informed decisions about where we're going to put the garden, here's some things we might need to consider, right? So site selection would be impacted by trees, right? Trees provide shade to the garden. The root systems of trees are quite extensive, reaching out hundreds of feet from the trunk. And those root systems can compete with vegetables for nutrients and water as well. So try to locate your garden away from trees. Those trees can also be the homes to some unwanted critters around the garden as well. Things like raccoons, opossums, squirrels, may be more likely to be in the garden if there's trees nearby. There's one particular tree that we need to watch out for, and that's black walnut, right? Black walnut secretes a compound called juglone. When juglone gets into the soil, it can wreak havoc with several plants, many vegetable plants. Plants such as peppers and tomatoes actually get a condition called black walnut wilt if black walnuts are nearby. And so it's especially prudent to stay away from black walnuts. So the second thing on the list there is buildings. So buildings can be both good and bad. Buildings can also cast shade to the garden. So you want to plant your garden on the south side of buildings. That's where the building will cast the least amount of shade. Likewise, the south side of trees. But buildings can also cause a problem if they're old buildings. In 1971, the EPA decided that we no longer needed to use paint that contained lead, right? So prior to 1971, and even after 1971, to some extent, people were still using paint that contained lead. Now, the problem is, if you're gardening on a site where an old building used to be, your soil could be contaminated from paint chips that contain lead, right? So just be aware of that. Now, lead poses a problem not in that it is taken up by plants, but that lead-containing soil contaminates the surface of plant parts that we may eat, right? So we have to be careful if we think we're gardening around soils that are contaminated with lead. One thing that buildings can give us is a source of water, right? So a lot of people these days are interested in harvesting water. They'll put up a gutter system on a building and channel that to a rain barrel and use that water to water crops. And that's a great thing because then we're not relying on our municipal water supply to water plants. But now remember that that water in that rain barrel is not potable water, right? So if you're using that to water plants, then you need to wash those plants very well before you consume them, because that water could be contaminated with any sorts of things, what's growing in the rain barrel or what has been roosting on the roof there. So just remember that. But buildings can give us a source of water to use in the garden. Slope and elevation. Obviously we'd like to have a flat spot, but a flat spot at the base of a hill may be problematic because cold air tends to drain to lower sites. And so low sites tend to be more prone to late spring and early fall frost. That can be a problem. So a little bit of an elevation or a little bit of a slope can be a good thing. And soil drainage, we like to have well-drained soils for most of our vegetables. A really easy test for soil drainage is you dig a hole that's about 12 inches deep. You fill it up with water. If it's real dry, you fill it up with water. You fill it up with water again. And then you watch it. You see how long does it take that water to leave that hole. If that water leaves in 1 to 2 days, generally your site has pretty good drainage, right? If it takes longer than about 2 days to drain, then you'll may want to do some things like build some raised beds or something to improve the drainage of their soil. And then finally, soil quality. So this is last on the list because this is the easiest thing to change. We can change soil quality by adding amendments to the soil, organic matter. We can change soil quality by adding fertilizers to the soil. And we'll talk about all those things later. But one of the things I tell my students is that if you don't have ample sunshine, none of these other things really matter. So most garden plants are full sun plants. Horticulturally, we say that full sun plants need at least about 5 to 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. So if you don't have ample sunlight, it's really hard to have a good garden. So I'll pause here and see if there's any questions or if you put any questions in the chat box. Anything there, Phil?
Feel free to put your questions in the chat box as we go. If we'll take breaks, we'll get those questions answered. But as of right now, Rick, I don't have any questions.
That's great. So I'll just try to pause occasionally and see what's going on. So the second step in planting is to think about how much to plant. Now, if you're a novice gardener, maybe you think, well, I really like zucchini squash, right? So I'm going to plant a 20-foot row of zucchini squash in my, small backyard garden because I really like zucchini squash. Well, if you have good luck with your zucchini squash, you're going to have enough yield to feed your entire neighborhood, right? So that's where this table 1, really comes into play, especially for novice gardeners. And I've just got a part of it here. It goes on all the way down to zucchini, but it talks about, how much average yield would you expect from, say, a 10-foot row, and sometimes you don't need a 10-foot row, or how much you need to plant, per person for fresh consumption, or maybe a little bit extra to plant if you want to store some or freeze some or can some, right? So this is just a kind of a benchmark data for helping you to determine, how much of a particular crop to grow when you're first starting out. Now, the second point there is to keep records. So that's really where it comes into play, right? So as you go from year to year, it's really a good idea to keep some records about your garden. Think about what crops did really, really well. How much did you plant? How much should you plant next year? What varieties did you plant? So for me, I like to plant a lot of different varieties, especially of tomatoes and peppers. Right now, it's hard. I plant those things in the spring, and come late summer and fall, I've usually forgotten what the names of many of those varieties are. And so take some notes through the season about how things perform, and then you've got a better understanding of where you may go next year with planting your garden. And the third thing there is to locate plants wisely, right? So there are a few vegetables that are perennials. So things like rhubarb, asparagus, these things come back year after year. Excuse me. Maybe you've decided to plant some small fruit in your garden. We'll talk about that next week. Things like blackberries, raspberries, blueberries. These are all perennials. So it makes sense when you're planting perennials to plant all of those plants together at one edge of your garden, because all these other plants are annuals. You're planting them new every year, and you want to be able to work up the soil. If you've got perennial plants mixed in, it's going to be harder to work up that soil because you don't want to damage, those perennial plants. And finally, just as we talked about trees and buildings, we locate them on the north side of our garden. We plant the garden to the south side. If you've got tall plants in your garden, things like sweet corn or pole beans, plant those on the north side of your garden. That way they won't shade smaller plants to the south. Another thing in planting is soil preparation, right? So your first step in soil preparation should be to do a soil test. So I'm not going to go into how to do that on this presentation, but any number of these county agents on the call today would be more than happy to help you to learn how to do a soil test. We recommend doing a soil test every few years. Certainly, if you do a soil test and there's problems, maybe repeat it the next year. But if everything looks normal, then you do that every few years. One of the things, and a very important thing that the soil test will tell you, is pH of your soil. Now, most of our garden vegetables like a pH that's slightly acid. So usually around pH 6, give or take a few points there. So if your pH, comes back lower than 6, they're going to tell you to add some lime, to incorporate lime into your soil to raise that pH. If your pH comes back much higher than 6, they may encourage you to incorporate some sulfur or sulfur-containing compounds to lower the pH. In Kentucky, we're usually more about raising the pH slightly than we are about lowering the pH, unless we're growing things like blueberries. Again, we'll talk about that next week. So fertilization, use your soil test recommendations. Generally in Kentucky, we find that most soil test recommendations, the only required additive is nitrogen. Very rarely do we find instances where we need to add phosphorus and potassium. And then micronutrients, usually our soils are adequate there. So usually it's just nitrogen, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. And then finally, working up the soil, right? Compaction, tillage and compaction, unfortunately, kind of go hand in hand. You think using a rototiller, you're stirring up the soil, you're making it into a, kind of a fine powder. That may be too much tilling. We do want the soil to be friable, to be crumbly when we, move it in our hands. But what we find is that the overuse of tilling and even plowing can result in subsoil compaction. And so what this means, think about the tillers, the tines of those tillers are going about, they're working up the top part of the soil, but at the interface where they're meeting the soil, they're actually hitting the soil and compacting that layer of soil. And over time, that creates a barrier that prevents water and air from moving through the soil, and that can be a problem. So certainly, it's fine to use tilling in the spring to loosen up the soil for the first time to prepare your seed beds. But I tend to discourage people from using tilling as a routine way of getting rid of weeds. I think it's much better to use some light hoeing or hand pulling for weeds rather than, doing a twice a month till through the garden. I think that can result in some compaction issues. Okay, so I said we'd talk a little bit more about fertilizers, and probably many of you all know this from farm backgrounds, but fertilizers, most of our garden type fertilizers and all fertilizers for that matter are going to have 3 numbers prominent on the label of the fertilizer. And so in this example, we've got 1648, right? So that first number always stands for nitrogen, the second number more or less for phosphorus, the third number more or less for potassium or potash. And so except for nitrogen, those phosphorus and potassium can be in a little bit different form, but we're not going to worry about that too much, okay? So if we have a complete fertilizer, it means that it has numbers in all 3 of those positions, right? So like we have there, 1648, that would be a complete fertilizer. So a lot of the fertilizers you see sold in stores as garden fertilizers are complete fertilizers. And usually they're labeled as 10-10-10, 20-20-20, or 5-10-10, right? Now, there are also incomplete fertilizers. Some very popular incomplete fertilizers are high nitrogen fertilizers. So we've got 3300, which is ammonium nitrate. Now, that's not as available as it used to be, but you can still find it in some stores. Or 4400, that's urea. Sometimes you actually see urea sold as 3300. They've diluted down the formulation a little bit. So both of those would be incomplete fertilizers having only nitrogen. And then the third example there is 15015, right? So that fertilizer would have nitrogen and potash or potassium, but no phosphorus, okay? And then we have organic fertilizers. So organic fertilizers generally have much lower formulations. They have lower percentages of nutrients, but they do have high organic matter. And so the trade-off is that you're applying less nutrients to your soil, but you're applying organic matter, which in and of itself is very beneficial to the soil. Now, remember on the previous slide, I said that with most soil tests in Kentucky, we find no need for added phosphorus and potassium, right? So with phosphorus in particular, we run into some problems in our rivers and lakes and even into the Gulf of Mexico with excess phosphorus. In our fresh waters where we see a lot of algae bloom and things like that, that's usually due to excess phosphorus. Now, if you get into salt waters, it's usually excess nitrogen, right? But in our waters, that excess phosphorus can cause a big problem. So our advice to people who are applying fertilizers in the home landscape is that if you do not do a soil test, then you should apply only nitrogen. And the basic rate for home gardens is about 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Okay, and again, your county agent can help you with that math there and deciding how much to add to your particular site. Now, certainly, if you've done a soil test and a soil test says you need phosphorus and potassium, then choose a fertilizer that has those nutrients. But by and large, I mean, I'm most familiar with what's going on in central Kentucky, and by and large, with the exception of some far western counties, most counties, 95% of the soil test would say you only need to add nitrogen, right? So in the absence of soil test, apply only nitrogen at that rate of about 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Now, there's also opportunities maybe to apply some other amendments, right? So a lot of people will plant a cover crop in the fall. That's a good thing. That cover crop actually pulls up nitrogen from the soil, stores it in that crop, and then in the spring, you turn that crop under, it decays and adds those nutrients back. So that's a great thing, right? Manures are very good sources of organic matter and nutrients. What you have to watch out for manures is fresh manures contain microbes that are not, good for us, that can cause health problems for humans if you consume them. So the recommendation, if you're using fresh manure, you should not apply fresh manure within 120 days of a vegetable harvest, right? So now that's not 120 days before planting, that's 120 days before you expect a harvest. Now, if you're applying composted manure like bag products, you can apply that much closer, right? Peat and humus, great sources of organic matter. We especially use peat to help with soil pH. Compost, it'd be great to have a backyard composting talk sometime, but compost is great organic matter. One thing I would say for compost is it's better to incorporate the compost into the soil than to use it as a mulch, because compost that's not incorporated tends to cake on the top of the soil and may cause a problem with the water movement into the soil. Mulches. We'll talk a little bit about mulches later. Hardwood mulches are not usually good for the garden. They get incorporated into the soil. They tie up lots of nitrogen and can rob plants of nitrogen. And then finally, I talked earlier about poor drainage. Some people think, well, if I just add some sand and gravel to my garden, that'll improve my drainage. Well, it doesn't really. The drainage issue is a much deeper issue, right? So the sand and gravel that you add really does very little to increase drainage. To increase drainage, really, organic matter is a good thing, or to build the soil up through raised beds. Okay, planting dates. I'd like for you to think about 3 seasons. We have 2 cool seasons. We have a spring and fall. We usually include crops there that can withstand some frost. So, and we'll talk about a few of those in a minute. Then we have the warm season, which I think is what most people think about with gardening. This would be the time between our last spring frost and our first fall frost, right? That time when warm season vegetables can grow and mature. Now, we'll take a look at planting dates in just a second, but in ID 128, we've got 3 figures that talk about plants for the spring garden, the summer garden, the fall garden. And then we have 2 big tables. One table that kind of goes through the calendar and talks about when to plant certain things. And then table 15, which is this table, goes through crop by crop and then tells you when you should be planting, right? So the county agents tell me, is the most sought after information in ID 128 right here, right? So a lot of good information here. So let's just take snap beans, for example. It's the second one down. So the columns to the right are divided into 3 sets. So we've got planting dates for Western Kentucky, Central Kentucky, and Eastern Kentucky. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of you all on the call are from Eastern Kentucky, but I'm assuming that there may be some from all around, right?
Hey,
So
Rick, don't make that assumption. I forgot to say that we have got people from all across the state.
Yeah.
East, Central, and West.
That's what I thought. So, but this is basically, for a lot of crops, this is based on frost-free dates, right? Now, for beans, beans cannot withstand much frost at all. So you can see, for instance, in central Kentucky, we've got beans being planted around April 25th, okay? So we figure we plant these beans, and it's going to take them usually 7 to 10 days to germinate and poke their little cotyledons above the soil. And really, until they start developing those first true leaves, they're not very sensitive to frost there, right? But once those first true leaves come, usually about 2 weeks later, then you got to watch out for frost. So in central Kentucky, generally we look for our last frost as May, like 7 to the 14th, somewhere like that, the end of the first or second week of May. So if you look down through there and you see plants that are being planted, in late April, it means that they may withstand just a little bit of frost. If they're planted more in, May, then they're going to withstand less frost, right? And then, of course, if they're planted in March or April, then they're plants that can withstand quite a bit of frost. So we see the earliest safe planting date, would be our spring planting date. And then that latest safe planting date would be a summer or fall date. And that date takes into account the average days to maturity for a particular crop, right? So beans, we're looking at what, maybe 75 to 85 days to mature a crop. So we're planting, basically in mid to late June, early July, depending on what part of the state we are. That will give us, a couple of good months to mature that crop before temperatures cool and we get frost in the fall. So anyway, this is a lot of good information here in this table. Okay, so any questions so far, Phil?
Yes, I do. I got 2 questions. We got to go back a little bit here. When you mentioned the walnut tree, if a person removes the walnut tree, how long will that chemical stay in the soil?
So most people say that it can take a couple of years for it to dissipate in the soil. So I would say probably at least 2 years.
Okay. Second question. When you were talking about tilling the soil and we get into a compaction issue, a lot of small gardeners don't have access to big equipment to bust up that hard pan like farmers do. Any suggestions on some cover crops or anything like that we can kind of naturally break that hard pan up?
Well, sure. Any cover crop would work. I would say some of the legumes might be a little bit more deeply rooted, but also a good shovel can help break up that compaction as well. Unfortunately, in landscaping, we talk about when you're planting like a tree, the harder it is to dig the hole, the wider the hole needs to be, due to compaction. So if you're having trouble, with a shovel in your garden, it probably means, unfortunately, that you need to use your shovel more in the garden and break up some of that compaction. So.
Okay, another question. Is there a way to control weed seeds in manure?
You can compost it. And again, what I tell people is compost is only as good as the composter, because to get rid of weed seeds and really other unwanted organisms, you have to do what's called hot composting. So you got to have a big compost pile that gets hot in the middle, and you turn it periodically to get all of the material into the middle part of the compost pile to decompose. So that would be the way to get rid of weed seeds in manure.
Okay, this next question may be a little bit ahead of schedule, but I'll go ahead and ask it. It says a lot of gardeners are going to a no-till system with mulch on top. If the mulch is not brought underneath the soil, so it's just laying on top, will that still lock up our nitrogen?
So let's talk about that later. I'll have other alternatives than hardwood mulch as mulch, but we can talk about hardwood mulch later. I'll try to remember to bring that up, but I've got a slide on mulching a little bit later.
And that's all I got right now.
Okay, good. So, well, I think in terms of the unexpected pleasures of gardening, for me, it kind of hinges around what's new, right? So I want to spend some time and talk about some things to plant. And I do this for a couple of reasons, to show you some newer things, and also it reminds me to tell you some specific things about a few of these crops. Now, we're not going to be talking about everything tonight. There is a lot of information in ID 128 about specific crops. But where I get a lot of my information is through All America Selections. I've been involved with them for quite a while. I was a flower trial judge at the UK Arboretum for a number of years. I also grew a vegetable demonstration garden there. So All America Selections is a program where seed companies, any seed company, can pay All America Selections to trial some of their new varieties. And so what happens is they pay a fee, they send All America Selections seed of their new releases, and All America Selections will then pair those new varieties with standard established varieties and send those seed out to trial grounds all across North America. So all across the southern part of Canada, as well as many states in the United States. So we don't have a vegetable trial ground in Kentucky, but there is one in Tennessee, there is one in Ohio. So we're flanked pretty well there. And so these trial judges, what they do is they plan out these varieties, right? The new variety next to the established varieties. And throughout the season, they'll note the performance of this new variety and judge its performance, compared to this standard variety. So if in a number of trial grounds, this new variety performs better than the standard varieties, it becomes an All-America Selection winner, right? And so what I'm going to show you here is some of what I think are kind of noteworthy winners of the last probably 10 or 12 years, right? So it's a great place to get some information on new varieties. And you'll be able to tell when you're looking at in seed catalogs and things, the name here. I know my mouse is not working here, but you can see in the sign, there's a shield that says All America Selections, right? So that, or a kind of a starburst, All America Selections, is going to be on the label of any plants that have been deemed All America Selection winners. So let's just look at some of these. So I'm trying to kind of get some of these first ones as things that are cool season crops, and really things like peas and radishes, it's getting about time to plant them, So some of the labels for these say plant as soon as the soil can be worked, right? So that's pretty soon. In fact, in central Kentucky, we would say plant peas in late February to early March, similar for radishes, right? But this pea snack hero has pods that are 4 to 5 inches long, extremely long peas. They're sugar peas, and so they look almost like beans. So that's a 2011 winner for All America Selections. And then the radishes here were just to remind me that radishes can be planted really soon, and you can plant radishes in containers if you want as well. They take up very little space, and they mature very quickly, usually 30 to 45 days, very quick. Cabbages, also cool season crops. They can go in usually about mid-March or so, depending on where you're at in the state. But a couple of varieties here. The first one, the top one, is Cabbage Dynamo. This is a small-headed cabbage. All America Selections kind of promotes varieties that are good for home gardeners, especially home gardeners that don't have a lot of space, right? Doesn't mean you can't grow them in larger gardens, but Cabbage Dynamo, when I grew it, the thing I liked about it is it had a very long harvest window. If you've ever grown cabbage, you know that once those heads form, those heads are very prone to splitting, especially if you get a lot of rain. It causes that bud there to start growing again. It causes those heads to split. This Cabbage Dynamo is very resistant to that, so it had a very long harvest window. And the Savoy Express there, I just put that to indicate that, you know, not everything that's an All-American Selection winner may not be ideal for Kentucky. We found that this particular cabbage really didn't stand up too well to a lot of our summer rains and things, a lot of rotting and things. So it does have a very loose leaf arrangement, but we didn't do so well with that one. A couple other cool season crops. Here's kale prism. You know, kale was the miracle crop there for a year or two. It's kind of gone away now. There's something else there, but kale is a great cool season crop. What I find is that you plant kale in the spring, you harvest it up until the leaves start getting bitter. I don't pull up my kale. I let it stay there. I keep harvesting leaves. I don't eat them, you know, in the summer, but then in the fall, the leaves that are produced then are milder again. So you can actually get two crops off the same plant there. Broccoli artwork. This is a new type of broccoli. Well, a new type for All-American Selections. It's called a stemming broccoli, right? So we're used to broccolis that form that really big head, you know, that first head, and that's usually, you know, the prime thing that we consume. With this broccoli, it is better to go in and snap off that developing head, and then it produces multiple side shoots, abundant side shoots, more so than normal broccoli. So we call that stemming broccoli. It works really well. And then kohlrabi, I don't know if people are familiar with kohlrabi. It's a stem vegetable. What you see there is a fattened stem, and that's what you eat. It kind of has the flavor of, you know, broccoli stems or those sorts of things. All these are cold crops. Then onions. Onions are fairly cold hardy. Two types of onions. We have storage onions, like on the left, Superstar. This was a great onion. It grew bulbs that were like a pound in size. So that was nice, but it takes a long time to do that. You plant seeds early in the year, transplant plants out into the garden, and then it's usually like 120 days or so later that you get the storage onion. Now, bunching onions or green onions, they do best in spring or fall. You can plant seeds or transplants. Transplants, you save about 30 days on the harvest, you know, for 30 days extra if you plant seeds. But the thing is, bunching onions never become storage onions, right? So I actually have some of these bunching wonder in my garden. I planted them in the spring. I didn't use them. They grew through the summer. I didn't use them. I looked after the snow went away. They're still green. They're there, but they're not making any big bulbs, right? They're still these green type onions. I imagine they get pretty hot during the summer, hot with flavor. But anyway, onions, again, fairly early crop to plant. Cilantro is a crop that a lot of us like to use, especially for Mexican dishes. Cilantro typically, you know, it germinates, it produces a little rosette of foliage, and that's when it's best to harvest. And once it starts to seed, its quality goes down, right? So Delfino is a cilantro that will continue to produce foliage even on the flower stalks, right? So it has a much longer harvest window than typical cilantros. Carrot purple haze, right? Unexpected. So I'll just leave it there, right? Purple through and through, a nice novelty thing to grow in your garden. Now, excuse me, in Kentucky, our heavy soils don't grow carrots too well. You really need to use raised beds with amended soils, lots of organic matter to get those nice carrot roots to form. Bright light Swiss chard is one of the last cooler season plants. It's a great plant. You can start it in the cool of the year, but it grows well into the summer. And it's used as a green, right? As a pot green. And it doesn't get peppery and hot flavored like mustard or spinach or kale. So it's a good summer green there. And then summer squash, papaya pear is just kind of a novelty in terms of the shape of the fruit, right? It's just a nice little summer squash. Okay, so moving into summer squash would be a after the danger of frost is past kind of crop, as is sweet corn, right? So we plant sweet corn usually a little bit before the end of frost, thinking that it'll take, a few days for it to germinate. But people more and more are planting these super, super sweet corns, right? One way to tell it's a super, super sweet corn is the kernels that you're planting are really, really shriveled. And these super sweet corns don't have a lot of seedling vigor. So you need to plant them shallow. You need to plant them in warm soils. So that means it's probably better to wait till after the danger of frost is past, maybe, say for most of us into late May or early June to plant these corns. You'll get off to a better start. But the two on the left are sweet corns. And then the one on the right, I say, is more of a novelty type. It's not as sweet, but look at it. It's Indian summer, right? It's one of the first sweet corns that has the color coordination of Indian corn in the ear, right? So, imagine giving a dinner party where you've got these rolled up in aluminum foil and roasted, and people unroll them to find this. It just would be a novelty, right? So, and there's a lesson there too. If you boil this Indian summer, a lot of that coloration goes away. So you really want to roast it either in the shuck or roast it, in aluminum foil or something like that. Don't boil it. Make sure it's roasting ears, not boiling ears. Beans, I got a couple here. On the left is a pole bean, Seychelles. Of course, it's hard to go wrong with our Kentucky Wonder pole bean. But pole beans, they have to have support. You can grow them either along a fence line. You can grow them in corn, although your yield is going to be sacrificed in corn because you've got the shading of the corn. Or you can trellis them with some type of pole type apparatus. So pole beans, good, and then bush beans. Bush beans tend to be a little bit more productive, although pole beans tend to produce the whole season long. Bush beans tend to produce 2 or 3 crops, and then they're usually gone. So a little bit about plant architecture here. For some plants, we have plants that we call determinate, and then they have other varieties that are indeterminate. So pole beans are indeterminate. They will keep growing as long as the weather and they have a support to grow. They don't get too much disease pressure. They'll keep growing and producing. Bush beans are determinate. They only get so high. They put on a lot of fruit, a lot of beans, generally simultaneously in 2 or 3 crops, and then they're finished, right? So determinate, indeterminate there. Okay, so peppers. There must be in the last 10 years, 15 years, 10 or 15 peppers that are All-America Selection winners. I'm not going through all of them. I'm going to highlight just a couple of them. The first 2 here are sweet peppers. The one on the left is Blushing Beauty. I highlight it because it is never green. It's a bell pepper that starts off on the plant as kind of an ivory color. And then as it matures, it will turn orange and then red, right? So it's kind of a novelty plant. And so we think about these novelty plants, as something that are, unexpected. But if you're a city gardener and maybe the only place you have to garden is in some of your flower beds, right? So you might want some of these plants that are novelty plants that are also kind of ornamental. So it would be ornamental. Then on the one on the right is Giant Marconi. It's an Italian roasting pepper, again, a sweet pepper. But these peppers are easily 6 to 8 inches long. So really big peppers and good yields on this as well. So a hot pepper, pepper cayenne, red ember. Again, kind of a nice ornamental pepper, but you have to put your hats off to Mad Hatter there on the right? So if you've been to any of the UK field days, we have a researcher here, John Snyder, who has worked on Una tuba peppers. So this Mad Hatter is this type of pepper, and they range in heat. So Mad Hatter is very, for the most part, very mild, right? But it has this, the lobes flare out, and it makes it a nice pepper that if you're going to stuff with things, it usually presents really well on the salad plate. Okay, I got to hurry up here. I'm getting behind. So last one here is pepper sweet, just sweet, right? I show it because, again, kind of its ornamental characteristics. And then we get into tomatoes. So the first tomato I put here is tomato apple yellow. I just put it here because it looks like a pepper, right? Except for the stem there, the calyx. So that's apple yellow. Here's some cherry type peppers, sugary, jolly. Jolly actually is more of a pink pepper than red. And then crocchini is a very small kind of marble size pepper. All of these very productive, very high sugar, right? With these cherry type peppers. Then All American Selections is kind of going after the heirloom market. Now, these are not heirlooms. These are F1 hybrids, but they look kind of like heirlooms, right? You got Buffalo Sun on the left there, and then Mountain Road on the right. So don't get Mountain Road confused with some of the mountain cultivars that our commercial growers are growing. So all of the peppers I've said so far are indeterminate plants, just like the pole bean. You got to stake them. They're going to keep growing as long as they have favorable conditions, right? But there are some determinate tomatoes as well. Our commercial producers usually grow determinate tomatoes. So remember, determinate, think of short, stocky plants, and then more concentrated crops of fruit. Doesn't mean that they're going to harvest all of them at the same time, but they generally don't produce as long as the indeterminate types. So we got Galahad there as a pink variety, and then Torenzo and the Patio Choice Yellow are two little determinate cherry types that are really well suited to containers. So eggplants. In 2 years' time, All American Selection recognized 3 eggplants. So we had Hansel, Gretel, and Fairy Tales, right? So they're all these little slender kind of Italian type eggplants. So eggplants, and I'll just, this reminds me that we've talked about peppers, tomatoes, and now eggplant. All 3 of these crops are in the same plant family, right? So if we have a large garden, it does us well to not repeat grow these three groups of plants together for more than about 3 years. What we want to do is grow them in a location for 2 or 3 years and then move them somewhere else, because many of them are subject to some soil-borne diseases, and keeping them in the same site allows the soil to build up those diseases, right? So moving around like that, we call it crop rotation. What I tell people with small gardens is if you want to practice crop rotation, just don't grow some of these varieties for a year or 2 years, or grow them in containers as opposed to in your garden, right? You can't have a garden without tomatoes, but maybe you could have, some 5-gallon buckets around your garden with the tomatoes in it, giving your garden soil a rest from this group of plants. Here's okra. The key to okra in Kentucky is to find varieties that have short maturation dates, because a lot of okra is, adapted for more southern gardens, and they have a longer growing period. So both of these do pretty well here. Okay, some watermelons. Several watermelons in the last few years. These are kind of standard watermelons. They're seeded watermelons, either oval or oblong, and they're all in the range of, say, 10 to 15 pounds, right? Not big watermelons, but not the little, personal watermelons that you see in the store. So one thing I'll say about New Queen, it is a yellow flesh watermelon. If you were blindfolded and had yellow flesh and red flesh melons in front of you and you were tasting them, I dare say you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right? So that yellow flesh is just kind of a novelty thing. And we'll see another one here in a second. So, and in terms of novelty melons, here's some examples, right? So Harvest Moon, you may be familiar with the heirloom variety Moon and Stars. So Harvest Moon has the little dots and moon on the surface, just like Moon and Stars. And it's also a seedless watermelon. It's one of the only seedless, and far as I know, the only one seedless watermelon, excuse me, that have been marketed to homeowners. And I don't think it went over very well, because to grow seedless watermelons, you have to grow the variety that is seedless, which is Harvest Moon. And then in the same seed packet, you get a companion plant. That companion plant is a pollinator for this variety, right? So right out of the gate, you have to plant 2 varieties of watermelons together, right? And it's a lot of times it's hard to get these seedless watermelon seeds to germinate. So it hasn't been that big of a success. I'm really interested in this cow sweet bush because it's a bush type watermelon. And what that means is that the vines usually stay about 18 inches long. So it would be suitable for, small gardens, for even for containers. And then that golden gold there not only has the yellow flesh, but has a yellow rind as well. So that's kind of novel. Pumpkins, lots of pumpkins and squash. So Orange Smoothie is a small pumpkin. It was released as much for the craft market as anything, because it has a smooth stem pedicel. The flesh, the skin is very smooth, so it makes it very easy to paint and easy for young hands to hold, right? Blueprints, you can see there's interest in these kind of ghost pumpkins or different color pumpkins. Here's some winter squash, bonbon, honey bear, and then a couple of others, bush delicata, which actually got a commendation for edible quality. Many of the judges said that it was some of the sweetest squash that they'd ever eaten, right? And then Goldilocks with this nice coloration. We got cucumbers. So cucumbers On the left is Diva. It's a slicing cucumber. On the right is Green Lights. It's a salad cucumber. So if you've been to the supermarket and you see these little cucumbers with 2 or 3 small cucumbers in a package, that's what this is. Meant to be picked when it's 3 or 4 inches long. So one thing about cucumbers, cucumbers are very susceptible to an insect, cucumber beetle, and that insect vectors a disease, cucumber wilt. And so the combination of those really impacts our ability to grow cucumbers. So what some of our commercial growers will do, well, they'll grow them in greenhouses or they'll grow them under netting, right? So traditional cucumbers require pollination in order for the fruit to set. If you don't have bees, you don't get pollination, you don't get fruit set. So it's kind of hard to get pollination under these barriers, these netting. These particular varieties are what are called parthenocarpic. They will set fruit even without pollination. So that's kind of a breakthrough in terms of production of cucumbers under cover to help keep them away from cucumber beetles. Okay, so any questions so far? Phil, I know I'm going a little bit long. Is it okay to go about 10 more minutes?
Yeah, we're good. I do have some questions if you want to address those. All right, let's see. Where can you purchase All American Selections app?
So I gave you the website at the beginning of where we were talking about different vegetables. If you go to that website, they will tell you who is marketing their varieties.
All right, next question is a comment from Amanda. She said she loves growing kale trees.
Yeah, that's what happens when you grow through the summer. Yeah.
All right, got should home gardeners be concerned about the locusts that are expected to surface this year? And there's another question that any advice on the possible cicada infestation this year?
So locusts and cicadas, as far as I know, I don't think they feed very much in the adult form. Now they cause damage on trees and nursery stock because they slit little slices in the small twigs of trees to lay their eggs. But I don't think they really feed very much. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't think that's a big problem for vegetables and things.
Okay, I'll double check with Rick Besson, and we'll bring it up next week.
Check with Rick Besson and see what he says.
One more quick question before I ask that. April did put the website for All American Seeds in the chat box, so you can click on that. What's an easy way to tell when watermelons are ripe?
Oh, I was going to talk about that. So with seeded melons, my understanding is the best way to tell is on the vines, there are little twirls. And there's usually a twirl. A twirl is like a modified leaf. There's usually a twirl right across the vine from where a fruit is forming, right? So if it's a seeded melon, that twirl will die as the watermelon ripens. Doesn't work for seedless melons, but for seeded melons, that twirl, once that twirl dies, it's a good indication that watermelon is ripe. Also, if you look at the belly of the watermelon where it was laying on the ground, you want that to kind of turn a yellowish cream color as opposed to green. So that's a good indication as well.
And that's all I have right at the moment.
Okay, good. So I'll go about 10 more minutes, and if anybody needs to leave, we certainly understand. If that was a question, I didn't get it.
I think we're good, Doc.
Okay. So some care during the growing season. So water, generally we we like to see about an inch of water a week. If you've got raised beds, it's usually a little bit more than that. If it's containers, it's a lot more than that because they dry out really quickly. So in Kentucky, we get like, 48 to 52 inches on average of water a year. But that doesn't mean that we get an inch a week, right? Sometimes our water is not, it doesn't come at the right times. So if we're going to water, it's better to water infrequently but thoroughly. Like put a lot of water down, once a week as opposed to watering a little bit every day. So when you're watering, wet the soil, not the plant, is always a good practice. Water during the cool of the morning is a good practice as well. And then there's lots of automated systems, drip irrigation that work really well as well. And so for certain crops, there's critical times for watering when they're maturing and things, and you can find that in table 16 there. So here we're on mulch, right? So I highly recommend doing some type of mulch because it really helps to reduce the water evaporation from the soil surface. It keeps roots moist. In some cases, it keeps roots a little cooler. Can also reduce weed germination. So do we use organic or inorganic mulch, right? So on the right-hand picture, we got pictures of some black plastic being spread over the ground. I really like black plastic as a mulch. It's easy to put down. You think, how in the world will the plants get water? But you're going to make holes in this plastic to insert plants or to insert seeds. And generally speaking, there's going to be plenty of access for water to get into that mulch. What I find is that, the soil under that plastic is not even. There's dips. And if there's a dip, if I see water standing there, I will go through and poke that plastic to allow the water to infiltrate the soil. And if you're really, engineering, you can put drip tapes or soaker hoses under that plastic to deliver water directly to the plant roots. So now, organic mulches. Straw is a great mulch. Leaves, especially if you can, chop them up, are a great mulch. I talked about compost earlier. It's not really the greatest mulch, but you can incorporate it into the upper soil levels is good. Putting down newspaper works. Sometimes I put down pizza boxes in the box of my rows, the middles of my rows. That works well. So the question earlier about hardwood. So if you put hardwood down, the problem is, so if you just have hardwood, we're always in our garden with a hoe doing a little hoeing, right? And that incorporates that hardwood into the soil. And that's what you want to watch out for. Now, if you put down, a layer of newspaper or a layer of cardboard and put some hardwood mulch on top of that, I think that would be fine. But the problem is, what do you do next spring, right? Because that hardwood probably won't break down very much. And so in the spring, when you're getting the garden ready to plant again, you may be incorporating that hardwood at that point. And, you either have to increase your nitrogen levels or you may be robbing your plants from nitrogen. So that's what I think about hardwood mulches. And certainly you don't want to use any hardwood mulches that are harvested from black walnut, right? Fertilization, based on a soil test, nitrogen, usually the only thing we need, 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So with a lot of crops, the crop will outlive the nitrogen in the soil. The soil loses its nitrogen over time through plant uptake and leaching. So you may need to supplement the nitrogen sometime during the season. There's instructions for that in table 17. It's basically use a high nitrogen fertilizer and just put like a half a tablespoon per foot of row around your plants. If you're using compost and organic mulch, that's probably already supplying some slow release nutrients. So you may not need to side dress with those things. Okay, pest control, right? So one thing you'll notice if you get a hard copy of ID 128 is that there's a staple in the middle of it and you open it, everything on your right side is pretty much deals with pests and diseases, right? So there's lots of very specific information there on what to use for different pests and diseases. I like to follow an IPM, integrated management approach, integrated pest management approach. If you can find plant varieties that are resistant, plant those. That gives us, a step ahead of getting, not even having to deal with pests. Do good cultural practices like cleaning up the garden when a crop is finished or crop rotation. Scout your garden. It's usually not a problem with homeowners because they're out in their garden usually several times a week looking to see what's coming on, what's getting ripe. Note the presence of problems, right? Don't necessarily reach for an insecticide or a pesticide right away, but note, are there problems? In this upper picture, you might see this and think, oh my goodness, what's going on here? But actually you do have a big infestation of aphids there, but the bigger insect there is the larvae of a ladybug beetle. So it is actually eating aphids. So you may have beneficial insects present that are doing their job, right? And then finally, practice the safest approach available. Now, I will say a little bit about organic approaches, right? So a lot of people are very interested in organic production. I think when you're, doing it in your backyard, you don't necessarily have to follow all the rules, exactly. Like, if you're an organic producer, you have to buy organic seed and organic fertilizers and organic pesticides. I think when you're a backyard producer, you can decide which of those things, you want to follow. But in terms of organic pesticides, they are naturally occurring. I've listed some very common ones there. Some are very widely used even in conventional type production. I think the thing that's good about organic pesticides is that they often break down faster in the environment. Now, that's good for the environment, right? If you're a producer, you might want to have something that sticks around a little bit longer, right? But that's the benefit. But just be aware that just because it says organic on the label doesn't mean it's harmless, right? Because there are some organic pesticides that can mess up the environment, mess up human health. So you need to handle all of these pesticides, whether they're, handle them just as if they were synthetic pesticides. So rotenone is a good example, right? So rotenone, we now know causes some neurological problems in people who have, acute exposure to it. So season extension, right? So getting a little bit more out of your garden. That this typically works better for us in the fall than the spring, right? Some people, we like to get our tomatoes out in the spring because we think that's going to get us a faster crop in the summer, right? And that's only partially true, right? It's not only the frost issue, it's the temperature of the soil. So if you're planting tomatoes, in late March, early April, you think, well, if it's frost, I'm just going to cover them up with a bucket. You may protect them from the frost, but they're not really doing much. They're sitting there in cold soils. They're not really growing much. So these season extensions are really better for the fall. So, if you've got raised beds, it's very easy to construct some kind of device where you can pull a sheet of plastic over that and protect that during cold weather, right? Or use cold frames or these water wells. So think about ways to extend the season. I think I'm going to skip this because this is kind of widely known information. You have my PowerPoint, I think, or will have it. You'll have access to this presentation. So this is just kind of some information about when to pick certain vegetables. One thing I will point out is tomatoes, right? So a lot of people think I'm going to grow tomatoes because I want vine ripened tomatoes. Well, the tomatoes you get in the grocery store from the greenhouses are vine ripened. We say a tomato is ripe when it first starts to color. And even these that are harvested, from greenhouses, when they're green, they're still going through this breaker stage and starting to color a little bit. So in the garden, if you're allowing your tomatoes to slightly turn color to ripen, to me, that's the time to harvest it. You can bring it inside. It will continue to color up on your, your counter. But if you allow it to continue to color in the garden, everything else knows it's there as well. The squirrels can see it better. The birds can see it better. And so you've got more of a chance for that fruit to be damaged by animals when it fully ripens on the vine, what fully colors on the vine, than if you pick it as it's first starting to ripen and take it indoors. So I'm not a connoisseur of fresh tomatoes. I eat cooked tomatoes all the time, but I don't like fresh tomatoes. But it's my understanding that you have no sacrifice in quality if you pick that tomato when it's first starting to ripen versus if you let it, fully color on the vine. So that's all I'll say about harvesting vegetables. Storing vegetables, let me just fast forward here because there's a few vegetables that we tend to automatically put in the refrigerator, and maybe that's not the best place for them, right? So this idea, so cold and moist would be the crops that we put into the refrigerator, and we keep them in a crisper drawer or an airtight container, right? Cool and moist means that we've got them not in the refrigerator, but maybe in some kind of paper bag or open plastic bag, somewhere where it's moist but not enclosed. And so things like cucumbers, summer squash, eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, they actually hold their quality better at these warmer temperatures than they do in the refrigerator. Now, they may last longer in the refrigerator without decay, but the quality is sacrificed. And one other thing is watermelons. You ever cut into a watermelon and the inside of it is dark, it's water soaked? That's a condition that usually arises when watermelons have been refrigerated too long. So for storage of watermelon, it's really best to keep them at room temperature. And then if you want to have them cold for consumption, put them in the refrigerator a few hours before you're going to cut them, right? So that's a little bit on storing vegetables. Fall, winter activities, it's always best to clean up the vegetable garden when crops are finished. A lot of times the same insects and diseases that are fed on your crop this year will overwinter on your crop in the garden and be ready to infect new plants in the spring, right? So clean out the garden. Soil testing is a great winter activity. You'll get your results back a lot quicker than if you do it this time of year when everybody else is doing it and it clogs up the system. Incorporating organic matter, especially manure, is a great thing in the winter. Sowing a cover crop, and then, of course, planting next year's garden. It's a good thing as well. Okay, so I'll stop here.